Uh, Good evening, everybody. Can we start? Okay. So, good evening again. Thanks for being here today with us, and thanks to the International Journalism Festival. Here in Perugia, last year, we didn't use the word regime in a way as explicit as today for Russia. What has changed since then? How has the nature of Putin's power evolved? We will address this question and other issues about the future of Russia with some of the most important voices of journalism and activism for democracy and human rights in Russia, and at the same time, direct victims of Putin's policies. Please welcome Alexander Baunov and Elena Kostyuchenko. In a while, we will listen to Evgenya Kara-Murza, activist and wife of Russia's most famous dissident in jail, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was convicted to 25 years of prison for high treason because he condemned the invasion of Ukraine. Yelena is connected with us remotely on video because she cannot be here for safety reasons. She's a Russian independent journalist and survived a poisoning attempt last year after she had already fled to Europe. She has been a special correspondent of Novaya Gazeta until the newspaper was shut down under the pressure of Russian authorities in March 2022. Alexander Baunov is a journalist and political scientist. Last year, the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation has added him to the register of foreign agents. He's the author of the bestseller The End of the Regime, and he is a researcher at the Carnegie Center in Berlin. I'm Marta Allevato. I have been a correspondent from Moscow for almost 10 years, and now I'm working for Italian news agency AGI in Rome. So, Russian authorities have prosecuted more than 116,000 activists during President Vladimir Putin's latest term in office, reaching levels of political repression unseen during the rule of Soviet leaders Khrushchev and Brezhnev. We have witnessed the brutality of this repression with the death of Alexei Navalny in jail in February. Let's start listening to what Evgenya Kara-Murza told us in this interview she gave us from Washington, D.C. just few days ago. Good evening, Evgenya. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me here today.
Evgenia, two tragedies hit Russia in less than 2 months: the death in jail of Navalny and the terror attack at the Crocus City Hall of Moscow. How did you react to both news? What do these two events tell us about Russia's internal problems?
Well, I would say that Russia has one huge internal problem, and that is the regime of Vladimir Putin. Everything else stems from that. And of course, both the assassination of Alexei Navalny and the terrorist attack on Crocus City were a terrible shock, and still are. And I mean, I think that millions of Russian citizens have yet to process both things. I know that Alexei Navalny's assassination was not the first political assassination carried out by the Putin regime. My husband survived 2 assassination attacks on him in 2015 and 2017. Both attacks were probably carried out by a team of FSB operatives, a team of assassins in the service of the Russian state that were implicated in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny with Novichok. As to the terrorist attack, again, this is unfortunately not new for Russia. After this attack, this recent terrorist attack on Crocus Hall in the Moscow region, we've already heard Vladimir Putin say that there were Ukrainian traces found in this terrorist attack. An absolutely ridiculous accusation that has no foundation at all, but it is clear that Vladimir Putin will want to use this attack to justify further aggression against Ukraine and further repression in the country.
After Navalny's death, everybody has immediately pointed at your husband as the political prisoner now more at risk. When did you last talk to him or see him? How is your husband dealing with this situation?
I have not seen my husband since his detention in April of 2022. I only talked to him a couple of times since his arrest. The last time we were allowed a phone call with Vladimir was last December, and that was a 15-minute phone call. Vladimir and I have 3 kids. A 15-minute phone call means each of them got 5 minutes on the phone with their dad. That is pure torture, psychological torture used by the regime.
You already told us about it, but the Russian jail system is one of the tools of the repression used by the regime. Can you tell us how it works in concrete, judging on your husband's experience?
The Russian regime has brought back the entire arsenal of Soviet-style repressive mechanisms. And those repressive mechanisms include Stalin-era prison terms of 10, 15, 25 years for speaking out against the regime, for denouncing the war in Ukraine. These mechanisms include punitive psychiatry, which means that some people are forcefully treated in so-called psychiatric hospitals because their opposition to the regime is seen as a sign of insanity. These repressive mechanisms also include extreme physical and sexual violence. In disciplinary cells, people are held in complete isolation from the world. They're denied medical care. They're held in very small cells that measure 3 by 5 meters, square meters, approximately. Like my husband, for example, he's held in a cell that measures 6 square meters. So people, the beds in those cells are affixed to the wall from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. There's one backless stool as the only piece of furniture in those cells. People are allowed very limited time with pen and paper, and sometimes they're completely denied that right to read or write. It feels like the regime is using every method possible of further breaking people and making them feel alone, isolated from the world, forgotten, which is why solidarity with political prisoners is so important.
The war has intensified repression in Russia. Without the invasion of Ukraine, do you think that your husband will still be in jail? And without the war, would have Navalny died anyway?
What we're witnessing today, this full-scale aggression against Ukraine, is was to some extent inevitable because it came as a result of over 2 decades of impunity that Vladimir Putin enjoyed while committing all those crimes in the past. When human rights violations are ignored or considered an internal affair of any state, time inevitably comes when internal repression crosses borders and turns into external aggression. If we want to see peace on this continent, Vladimir Putin needs to be stopped. The only guarantee of peace and stability on this continent is a democratic Russia. This is why it is so important to do everything possible to weaken the regime in the Kremlin so that it collapses and Russian civil society gets a chance of building a democracy in our country.
And speaking about opposition, your husband has been one of the protagonists of political time in which civil society has tried to oppose Putin by taking the streets to protest against him.
Has the opposition movement thought about the mistakes they made? Why didn't they succeed in stopping Putin? And what responsibilities do you think Western governments and societies may have in this?
One of the major mistakes made in the early 1990s were the failure to somehow process and come to terms with the crimes committed by the Soviet state. Unfortunately, the work was not supported by then leaders of the new democratic Russia, who very often said that this would be like a witch hunt. And well, the Soviet Union already collapsed. We don't need to go back there. We can just start from scratch. Which was not entirely true. Without processing the mistakes of the past, you cannot move into the future. And Vladimir Bukovsky used to respond to that argument about witches hunt, that the witches would come back and hunt us.
The last question, Evgenia. You are fighting for your husband and for human rights in Russia, while Yulia Navalnaya has promised to continue her husband's fight as well. What role can women have in Russian politics and civil society? And what's left of political opposition in Russia? How is political opposition abroad getting organized now?
Opposition is a political term that is applicable to a democracy. What we can talk about today, I think, can be called Russian pro-democracy and anti-war forces, which means all those civil society groups, human rights organizations, independent media, all of the people who represent Russian civil society. I very much admire Yulia Navalnaya's decision to continue Alexei's work. Her willingness to continue Alexei's work was seen as a sign of hope by millions of Russians around the world. The fact that she refuses to give in to intimidation and to give up despite the personal hell that she's going through right now is so incredibly admirable. The female face of this pro-democracy movement has always been there. I work with incredible women fighters, warriors, truly, warriors for democracy and change in Russia. I see that the female face is becoming more prominent. To me, this is a sign that the face of Russian pro-democracy movement in general is changing and is becoming more diverse. And I believe that this change that we're seeing in Russian pro-democracy movement in general is truly important, because this is the diversity that we need to build in society. This is the diversity that we need if we ever want to become a healthy democratic society.
Thank you, Evgenia. And we hope to see you in Perugia next year. Thank you.
It would be an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
So, Alexandra, we'll start with you. Kara-Murza told us about an increasing repression. Is that Russians don't realize what's going on, or just got used to it? Sorry. How do we explain the support for Putin that we have seen during the last elections, and what can we expect from his next mandate?
It's a multiple question. First, I would try to avoid to go into common wisdom that Russia is dictatorship, and in a dictatorship we don't have a freedom of the media, so many journalists are pressed, prosecuted, and so on. So it's too commonplace. I would like to maybe to stress some nuances of the current situation, and maybe some differences between the previous Putin's term and current Putin's term, before the war, after the war. First, the support. The big problem of Russian society is not its support of the war, it's basically its indifference, flexibility, and adaptivity. It can and may greet the freedom of the media, but it can live without it. There is no powerful social demand for the social freedoms, social political rights, and free media. Imagine the people that in 3 generations lived without free media, without private property, without the possibility to leave their apartments, their flats to their kids. It all belongs to the state. Then, out of the sudden, in 90s, they lost their jobs and little, but the salaries provided by the state, and found themselves in a terribly new situation. And then gradually they were deprived of the liberties they start getting used in the maybe 90s and early 2000s. And they are adapting themselves and to almost any situation. And it's not about they really want to defeat Ukraine or conquer Ukraine or want to kill Ukrainians. They are just, indifferent. The majority are, maybe it's in all societies, but especially in society with such a background, the majority of the people are just indifferent to Ukrainians as they are indifferent more or less to their neighbors, to themselves. It's a tradition of lack of, moral incentives, basically, and selfishness. It's a very egoistic society, but it started changing in the not in the 90s, maybe, because it was very hard time, but in the time of relative prosperity of early 2000, when so-called horizontal ties, horizontal trust started to emerge, the charities, the citizens' charities started to emerge, the horizontal ties were stronger and became stronger. But then, out of the sudden, Putin cut all this when started the war, and the first reaction was, let's somehow outweigh this. Maybe there is a chance to return to the life back as it was previously. When they discovered that the war is the new reality, and it's for a long time, maybe till the end of the ruler's life, they're just adapting to the new situation, like imagine the new ice period is coming and people are adapting to the life in new conditions. It's what happens. This is not the support of Putin, it's the acceptance of the new reality. And those who don't accept the new reality and do it actively are prosecuted, but the majority are just afraid to support them.
Elena, I'm coming to you. Thank you for being with us. The title of your book is I Love Russia, Reporting from a Lost Country. Your message is that you can love your country even without supporting the war. But in Russia now, it seems to me, at least, that you can't be neutral anymore. You have to take sides. There is no alternative between traitors and patriots. How has Russian journalism changed with the war?
First of all, can I a bit disagree with that? Like Russians are indifferent. I believe we have more trauma of helplessness than choice of indifference here. And if we go into statistics, we know that in November last year, we have new numbers from Levada, the Independent Sociological Center. And they say that almost 50% of Russians wouldn't start this war. They wouldn't want this war to be started if they could change it. And 23% of them, they don't even know why this war is going on. And 70% of Russians would support Putin if Putin would stop this war. The formula, like support Putin if Putin would stop this war, is essential because we have 2 new articles in our criminal and administrative code specifically punishing people for saying anything opposed the war. It can be from fine to up to 15 years in prison. So in that conditions of that repressions, we cannot really say that Russians don't fight for their freedoms because they are indifferent. They basically don't see the way and they don't feel the strength to fight for that. But it's not a choice. About Russian journalism, thank you so much for asking these questions. I can say that repressions on Russian journalism is enormous. Factually, our profession is criminalized in Russia right now. More than 1 million web pages were blocked since the beginning of the war. Many media were called as foreign agents or undesirable organization, and for collaborating with undesirable organization is also a prison term. Despite of all of that, Russian journalism, independent journalism exists. Many Russian media had to relocate abroad and they're working from there, but all of them has eyes and ears in Russia. And these eyes and ears are mostly very young correspondents who do field work anonymously. We still have journalists in Russia working anonymously, working in some media, but these journalists has to put some restrictions on themselves. Like it's technically impossible to call war a war in Russia without risking going to prison. And I also want to name some new media which were established after the full-scale invasion had started, like Verstka and Help Desk Media and some small medias, regional medias. They are basically booming right now. And for me, it's extremely important that those voices of those journalists would be heard here on the West, because it's really strange when I see how Western medias are taking numbers and facts from some propagandist sources like Russia Today, or like we said after last elections that 87% of Russians voted for Putin. Same time, we have reportages of independent journalists from Russia who showed the scale of falsification of those elections. And those witness accounts weren't so wide shared as the numbers. So thank you so much for this question. I believe it's very important to talk about those people.
Alexandra, in your book, you explain how right-wing dictatorships ended in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. How has the nature of Putin's power changed over time, and can Russia become a democracy?
Well, certainly it's another side of this flexibility of the Russian society. When I was talking about the indifference, I was trying to describe the mood of the group of Putin's supporters. Of course, there is and even here in this hall is present a part of the Russian civil society, a small minority of Russians who are living in Italy. There's a group, Russi contra la guerra. They are just came here for the conference and they are present here and they are very active in Rome. And of course, the repression is a proof, a large-scale repression after the war is a proof that you have whom to repress. Yeah, it's clear. And the very success of this book you've mentioned is, of course, partly a proof of the interest of the society to the topic of the end of the regime, how a dictatorship led by an aging man increasingly isolated in its worldview, in its picture of the world, translating this picture of the world. And if you follow the Putin's interviews and Putin's public appearances, you see that he's repeating the same things almost every day, several times a week. He's repeating the same takes, the same points. And if you, again, as we do in Russian journalism, observe him for years and even decades, you see the clear signs of even mental degradation of this person. And it was my interest to see how the dictatorship is ruled by an by an old dictator, like it was in the case of Spain and Portugal in late 60s, early 70s. And it appeared that Russians are very interested in the topic too. I mean, it was maybe among the books that appeared in last year in 2023, Russian non-fiction, new non-fiction books written by Russians, that was maybe number one, which, yes, is one of the proof of the interest of the society to the ending of the dictatorship, not the continuation of the dictatorship. Again, one of the reasons of the indifference is repression. Because if you are not indifferent, if you are start being involved in discussion, in activity, you're immediately oppressed. So it's the self-protection reaction.
Yeah, but on this background, how can we imagine a democratic Russia, as Evgenya Kara-Murza told us?
Well, basically there are two ways, or three maybe. All of them are described in the book as models. We can exclude the model of the ending of Italian dictatorship, or Mussolini dictatorship, or the Nazis in Germany, because both countries were defeated in the war. We see now that nobody is going, at least at this present stage, in the coalition that is ready to lead the war against Russia. If instead of Russia it was Iraq, this coalition would be already in place, but against Russia there is nothing alike. We have the first case in history when a nuclear state is waging an aggressive war of conquerence, conquering territories using its nuclear shield. It never happened before. It was a conflict between China and Vietnam in '78, if I remember well, but it was not about territories. So it may end, or let me stress one point. Everything and after the 2022 with Putin and even 23 seemed to shake. His power seemed to shake a little bit. Prigozhin's mutiny, defeats in the front in Ukraine, sanctions nobody expected in Russia, the massive economic pressure nobody expected in Russia. There were hopes that it will maybe collapse because it was a fatal mistake to start this war. It was clear for everybody. Then, by the end of 2023, the mood has changed, and now everybody is talking about how stable Putin's regime is because it survived so many challenges during the 2022-2023, during the 2 last years. And well, Putin was supported. We don't know about how many really people, because these numbers are not real. We don't have real numbers of his support. But still, we see that he survived. And the vulnerability of Russian regime is exactly in its vertical character. Everything is depending on one person. And this person is totally detached from the reality, and it's surrounded by the people. They can only confirm what the leader is saying. It's a complete isolation. But it's very shaky thing. It can seem strong at the moments, but there's no mechanisms to prevent the system from fatal mistakes in the further. One fatal mistake was made before our eyes. The system coped with this with the help of professionals who are still working in the Russian bureaucracy and the Russian nomenclatura, Russian business, which is adaptive, as I said, and this is of much help to the political regime, but it doesn't prevent, I mean, the system doesn't prevent any further fatal mistake.
Elena, the propaganda of traditional values based on the Orthodox religious faith and the family as a union between man and woman has become a real tool of repression. Russia got as far as banning LGBT movement. Why have LGBT people become an ideological enemy of the regime?
Well, I believe we have fascism in Russia, and for fascism you need mobilized society ready for the war, ready for participating in the war or waiting for the next war. And to mobilize society, you need enemies. You need external enemies and internal enemies. And about external enemies, it's quite obvious, like who they are, like West, United States, Ukraine. About internal enemies, it's not so clear. So LGBTQ were chosen for the role of internal enemies earlier than this big war, like in 2015. Then we were claimed as socially unequal to the others in our Russian legislation. Then the situation had been changing, and now we called as International Extremist Organization, LGBTQ+. We were chosen because we are ideal for this role. We are a minority, but quite a large minority to make everybody anxious. We look just the same, but we are so different. And we like spread through all the society, we like everywhere, and we're hiding. So we are really terrifying. We get like Putin couldn't play in national card because Russia is multinational country, and so that's why we were chosen. But there is more than that. Foucault wrote that there are like biopolitics and biorights, that every state tries to control the bodies of its citizens in different ways. And basically, if Putin believes, and if our state believes and make things work this way, that people being sent to war to kill and get killed, it's strange to wait from the same state the respect to like personal choices of people, personal lives. And the repressions against LGBTQs raising the fear of everyone, because everyone can be accused being queer. Everyone can be accused for sympathies. Like everybody feels that his private life is not that private anymore. And everybody feels that tomorrow can be their turn to become like enemy of society and the state. So basically we were chosen for very practical reasons, it works.
Okay, time is running out.
I can add to
Yes,
this
thanks.
because, you know, Russian citizens, and generally, as I started with this, have been deprived of their political and civil rights and freedoms. It's in the state, the regime wants to show to the citizens that there is a group that is have even less rights and freedoms that, well, the majority of the population. So the isolated and stigmatized groups have been created to show that, you know, you are okay. You have all full rights. You have all rights. You have everything. There are others in the country who are living a different life, who are really lower than you in the hierarchy. So they are creating an artificial hierarchy, you know. Any dictatorship is trying to create or find these groups of oppressed citizens to show to the others that we are together with you against those. So the group of LGBT, the group of foreign agents, for instance, are examples of these groups.
A final question for both of you. After more than 2 years of war in Ukraine, I have the impression that Europe doesn't know what to do with Russia. I mean, with its relationship with Moscow, and what to do with Russians who, like you too, left the country after the war. What do you think? Elena, first. I mean,
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question.
do you feel accepted in, are you in Europe, I guess? I mean, you fled to Europe, no, after the war. What do you think is the situation for Russian migration now in West, in Europe specifically? Because we know that there are many problems in living in Europe, like as Russians now. Something changed after the war, after the first year, because the months after the war were quite chaotic.
Well, there are some problems, but not that much as Russians living in Russia has problems. Their problems are bigger. So let's probably talk about that. I just want to tell that it's super important to see Russian civil society, which locates in Russia, although they became less and less visible because of repressions and because they cannot speak openly about a lot of things and name themselves. I want to tell about feminist anti-war resistance, which is a fantastic project horizontal project made by many women inside Russia, outside of Russia. It has quite a unique structure of cells, totally independent from each other, but who can unite for the common project. I want to tell about anti-war movement Vesna and Idite Lesом project and group of Lida Maniava, who's helping Ukrainian refugees to leave Russia or to stay in Russia and live decent life. And Idite Lesом is helping political people who've been politically prosecuted for their anti-war activities, or soldiers who've been mobilized on war. They help them to leave Russia illegally, and that's a huge help. There are many LGBTQ organizations working secretly right now in Russia. So basically, we have a lot of grassroots movements who cannot be very present in social media for obvious reasons, but they exist. And propaganda telling them that they are being hated by the rest of the world because they are Russians. It's very not true, and I know it's not true. And if I speak about my experience in exile, I mean, I got lots of help and support from European people. Mm-hmm. So I'm not feeling hatred or something, but propaganda is strong and people feel lonely. So if I may address to the audience, if you see project of civil society or group civil society or just a person in Russia who you want to support, don't hesitate to support them. We do need your support, and we do need they are not alone, and we do need to know that they are seen and heard, and let's make them visible, because they're definitely not less important than Putin. They are Russia too.
Thank you, Elena. If you want to adjust, we have very few
Quickly,
minutes.
yeah. I can
1 minute.
agree in the main point, a bit disagree in the details. The main point is that, yes, the message of Putin's broadcast is that Russians are hated in Europe, don't go there. It's not true. I'm in Europe from the spring of 2022, and there was no hate. Of course, I have the feeling of, like, I felt myself uncomfortable when saying that I'm Russian, but then I stopped feeling this sort of like shame, or because nobody cares really. From the other point of view, now we started with the Kara-Murza interview. If now Vladimir Kara-Murza is in jail, if he was not in jail but in immigration here in Europe, he could meet the same restrictions we sometimes meet here. I don't know, for instance, well, this is a good example, by the way. A Russian LGBT blogger, Elena knows him certainly, Karen Sheinian, was listed as terrorist and extremist by Putin's regime. I've tried to send him 10 euros for cocktail he bought for me in a Berlin bar, and I was called by my Austrian bank that asked me, who is this person? I wrote them and explained them who is he and what can be suspicious about him. It's, well, declaring that it's basically nothing. Still, the compliance of the bank didn't allow me to make this transfer. We discovered that some restrictions, especially applied by bureaucracy and by the companies, it's sometimes easier for both bureaucracy and the business to put aside all Russians than to start to go in depth and understand why this or other person can be in blacklist or in the question mark in compliance. Mm-hmm. For instance, I have being more or almost 2 years in Italy, I don't have Italian banking account because all Italian banks denies this. Guys and girls who are master students who are in European University in Florence, where I'm a visiting fellow, who are there before the war, have sometimes their accounts blocked. When coming to here, I decided to come here with a car, bringing my partner and my small dog. It was not possible because I was not able to rent a car because I have Italian guiding license, Russian passport, but the cards are Russian cards are not working here, and they need or the cards of the same country that the license or the cards of the same country as the passports.
So these are the same restrictions that we have.
And the visas issue is as well important because just one second, because what is trying to make.
No, I need to stop it. Sorry, because
okay.
They are just. So no, maybe we have time for one question. Maybe for Elena, who will leave us, and for the others, we will be outside. And Alexander is ready to answer to your question, but we need to free the room. Mm-hmm. So if there are questions to Elena from the audience, we have microphones available. Here, the lady.
Hi, thank you for the panel. Gabija Kučinskaitė from Lithuania. A few months ago, a very controversial interview by Tucker Carlson was released. And, well, he argued that we need to establish a communication link with Russia in order to hear both sides of the conflict. But by doing so, he created a perfect platform for propaganda. And without debunking it, he kind of legitimated his narrative. So my question is whether Western journalists should attempt to communicate with Kremlin while the war is still ongoing, and if so, in what format?
Thank you so much for this question. It's essential. I believe journalists has no other choice than to communicate with like everyone who's alive. We need to know what Putin thinks, but I believe that we need to know more than that, like what fears and hopes of so-called ordinary Russians and what's happening in Russia really. So I believe if we talk to Putin as a journalist, if we interview him, the questions should be way more tough than Tucker Carlson asked him. But that's like my perception. I don't think that silence is a good thing, but for journalists, but I see less and less point to communicate with Putin on political level because it doesn't seem like he's negotiable, though he wants to be looked like he's negotiable. So sorry for quite unstructured answer. I'm thinking about it every day myself.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Alexander. Thanks you. Thanks, everybody. And Alexander is ready to answer other questions outside. Bye.